Hi everyone, it's Miss LaChance back again with another read aloud video. Today we are going to be reading chapters 29 through 35 of Flora and Ulysses. If you need a refresher as to what happened in the last few chapters we read, you can go ahead and watch my last video. Otherwise, we're just gonna jump right into reading chapter 29 today. It's called Coochie Coo. The giant donut smelled like fried eggs and donuts in other people's closets. The dining room was full of laughter and donut dunking. A waitress sat Flora and her father at a booth in the corner and handed them glossy, enormous menus. Flora surreptitiously, the criminal element recommended surreptitious action at all possible junctures, removed the lid from the shoebox. Ulysses poked his head out and looked around the restaurant. And then he turned his attention to the menu. He stared at it with a dreamy look on his face. "Get whatever you want," said Flora's father. "Order your heart's desire." Ulysses emitted a happy sigh. "Pay attention," whispered Flora. A waitress came and stood over them. She tapped her pencil on the order pad. "What can I get you?" she said. Her name tag spelled out her name in all capital letters. Rita, with an exclamation point. Flora narrowed her eyes. The exclamation point made Rita seem untrustworthy, or, at the very least, insincere. Let's take a second to dive into that word, insincere. What do you think that means? I know that the prefix in means the opposite of, and what does that word sincere mean? So whatever sincere means, the opposite of that would be the definition of insincere. So if you guess the definition of sincere, meaning expressing genuine feelings or really meaning what you're saying, you would be correct. So the opposite of that, insincere, would be not really meaning what you're saying or not expressing genuine feelings. "Well," said Rita, "what's it gonna be?" Her hair was piled up very, very high on her head. She looked like Marie Antoinette. Not that Flora had ever seen Marie Antoinette, but she had read about her in a Terrible Things Can Happen to You issue on the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette, from the little bit that Flora knew about her, would have made a very bad waitress. Flora suddenly remembered that she had a squirrel in her lap. She tapped Ulysses on the head again. "Lie low," she whispered to him, "but be prepared." She arranged the washcloth so that he was almost completely hidden. "What you got there?" asked Rita. "Where?" said Flora. "In the box," said Rita. "Got a baby doll in the box? Are you talking to your baby doll?" "Talking to my baby doll," said Flora. She felt a rush of outrage crawl up her cheeks. For the love of Pete! She was 10 years old, almost 11. She knew how to administer CPR. She knew how to outwit an arch nemesis. She was acquainted with the profound importance of seal blubber. She was the sidekick to a superhero. Plus, she was a cynic. What self-respecting cynic would carry around a doll in a shoebox? "I do not," said Flora, "have a baby doll." "Let me see her," said Rita. "Don't be shy." She bent over. Her big Marie Antoinette hair scraped against Flora's chin. "No," said Flora. "George Buckman," said Flora's father in a worried voice. "How do you do?" "Coochie coo," said Rita. Flora felt a very pointed, very specific sense of doom. Rita poked her pencil into the shoebox slowly, slowly. She pushed the washcloth around slowly, and the washcloth, oh so slowly, fell back and revealed Ulysses's whiskered face. "George Buckman," said her father in a much louder voice. "How do you do?" Rita screamed a long, impossibly loud scream. Ulysses screamed in return, and then he leaped from the shoebox. At this point, things stopped proceeding at such a leisurely pace. The squirrel was airborne, and time swung back into action with a vengeance. "At last," thought Flora, "it's incandesto time." Chapter 30 is called Sunny Side Up. He had never been so frightened in his life. Never. The woman's face was monstrous. Her hair was monstrous. And the word on her name tag, Rita, with an exclamation point, appeared monstrous to him too. Be calm, he told himself as she poked her pencil around. He held himself as still as he could. But then Rita screamed, and it was absolutely impossible not to answer her long, piercing shriek with a piercing shriek of his own. She screamed, he screamed, and then every one of his animal instincts kicked in. He acted without thinking. He tried to escape. He leaped from the box and ended up, somehow, exactly where he did not want to be, in the middle of the monstrous hair. Rita jumped up and down. She put her hands to her head. She swatted and clawed, trying to dislodge him. The harder she hit, the higher he jumped, the more fiercely the squirrel clung. In this way, Rita and Ulysses danced together around the giant donut. "What's happening?" someone shouted. And here's a picture of the craziness that is happening in the book right now. In my last video, I said that one of my favorite chapters was coming up, and this is my favorite chapter, or one of my favorite chapters. "Her hair is on fire!" someone answered. No, there's something in her hair," another person shouted, "and it's alive!" "Ah!" screamed Rita. "Help me!" How, Ulysses wondered, had things gone so wrong? Only moments ago he had been looking at the giant donut menu, captivated by the glossy pictures of food and the dazzling descriptions that accompanied the pictures. There were giant donuts with sprinkles, giant donuts powdered, iced, giant donuts filled with things, jelly, cream, chocolate. He had never had a giant donut. Actually, he had never had any kind of donut. They looked delicious, all of them. How was a squirrel to choose? And to complicate matters, there were eggs, scrambled, poached, over easy, sunny side up. "Sunny side up," thought Ulysses as he clung to Rita's hair. What a wonderful phrase. A man emerged from the kitchen. He had on a gigantic white hat, and he was holding something metal that flashed in the overhead lights of the giant donut. It was a knife. "Help me!" screamed Rita. "And me," thought Ulysses. "Help me too." But he was quite certain that the man with the knife had no intention of helping him. And then he heard Flora's voice. He couldn't see her because Rita was now spinning around and everything in the restaurant had become somewhat blurred. All the faces had become one face. All the screams had become one scream. But Flora's voice stood out. It was the voice of the person he loved. He concentrated on her words. He worked to understand her. "Ulysses!" she shouted. "Ulysses, remember who you are!" Remember who he was? Who was he? As if Flora had heard his unspoken question, she answered, "You're Ulysses." "That's right," he thought. "I am." "Act!" shouted Flora. This was good advice. Flora was absolutely right. He was Ulysses, and he must act. The man with the knife stepped toward Rita. Ulysses loosened his hold on her hair. He leaped again. This time he leaped with purpose and intent. He leaped with all his strength. He flew. Chapter 31 is called Wholly Unanticipated Occurrences. Flora watched Ulysses fly over her, his tail extended at full length, and his front paws delicately pointed. It was just like her dream. He looked incredibly, undeniably heroic. "Holy Bagumba," said Flora. She climbed on top of the booth so that she had a better view. When Incandesto flew, when he became a brilliant streak of light in the darkness of the world, he was usually headed somewhere to save someone, and Dolores was always flying at his side, offering advice, encouragement, and wisdom. Flora wasn't sure exactly what Ulysses was doing, and it didn't look like he really knew either, but he was flying. "George Buckman," whispered her father, "how do you do?" Flora had forgotten about her father. He was looking up at Ulysses, and he was smiling. It wasn't a sad smile. It was a happy smile. "Pop?" said Flora. There was a long, loud scream from Rita. "It was in my hair!" she shouted. Someone threw a donut at Ulysses. A baby started to cry. Flora climbed out of the booth so that she could stand next to her father. She slipped her hand into his. "Wholly unanticipated occurrences," said Flora's father in the voice of Dolores. It had been a long time since Flora had heard her father say these words. "His name is Ulysses," she told him. Her father looked at her. He raised his eyebrows. "Ulysses," he said. He shook his head, and then he laughed. It was a single syllable. "Ha." And then he laughed longer. "Ha, ha, ha." Flora's heart opened inside of her. "Do not hope," she whispered to it. And then she noticed that the cook was leaping and twirling, waving his knife and trying to reach the flying squirrel. She looked up at her father. She said, "This malfeasance must be stopped, right?" "Right," said her father. And since her father agreed with her, Flora stuck out her foot and tripped the man with the knife. Chapter 32 is called Sprinkles, and it's a comic strip that goes on for 2 pages. So Ulysses is flying through the air, and he's thinking, "I love Flora." And Rita's screaming, "It was in my hair." He continues to fly. He sees the knife, flies away from it, and then splats on the window. And then Ulysses is thinking, "I flew. Where's Flora? Is that a piece of donut? Sprinkles." And then it looks like Ulysses faints or passes out. Chapter 33 is called Does Rabies Itch? His eyes were closed. His head was bleeding. Flora knew from Terrible Things Can Happen to You that head wounds bleed excessively, whether they are bad or not. "All head wounds bleed excessively," she said to her father. "Don't panic." "Okay," said her father. "Use this." He handed her his tie. Flora knelt down. She had a very powerful sense of déjà vu. Was it just yesterday that she had bent over the body of an unknown squirrel in Tootie's backyard? "Ulysses?" she said. She dabbed at the blood with the tie. The squirrel didn't open his eyes. An eerie quiet descended. The whole of the giant donut became preternaturally calm. Everything, the donuts, the squirrel, her father, seemed to hold its breath. Flora knew what was happening. She had read about it in Terrible Things Can Happen to You. It was the calm before the storm. The air becomes still, the birds stop singing, the world waits. And then the storm comes. Inside the giant donut, there was a moment of deep quiet, of collectively held breath. And then someone said, "I think it was a rat." "But it was flying," said another voice. "It was in my hair," said Rita. The cook shouted, "I'm going to call the cops. That's what I'm going to do." Rita was right behind him. "Forget about the cops, Ernie. Call the ambulance. I have rabies. It was in my hair." "You," said Ernie. He pointed at Flora with his knife. "You tripped me." "That's her," said Rita. "She's the one. Plus, she brought that thing in here in the first place. Dressed it up like a baby doll." "I did not," said Flora, "dress him up like a baby doll, and this is all your fault." The criminal element said that sometimes it was wise to put criminals on the defensive by making slanderous or blatantly untrue comments. The surprising unfairness of this tactic will often stop criminals in their tracks. It seems to work. Rita blinked. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "My fault?" she said. Flora bent over Ulysses and put a finger on his chest. She felt his heart beating in a slow, thoughtful way. Gratitude and relief washed through her, and her own heart, which had been beating much too quickly, slowed inside her chest. It answered the squirrel's heart with its own measured thud, thud, thud. "Ulysses," her heart seemed to say. "Ulysses." "I'm calling the cops," said Ernie. "George Buckman, how do you do?" shouted Flora's father. "Is there any reason to call the police?" "Well, for one," said Rita, "it was in my hair." "Do you think that the police should be notified of a squirrel in your hair?" said Flora's father. The idiocy of this question, its unsettling logic, made Flora suddenly grateful for her father. She picked up Ulysses and cradled him in her left arm. "I think I can feel the rabies coming on," said Rita. "My stomach itches." "Does rabies itch?" said Flora's father. "I'm going to call somebody," said Ernie. "She tripped me." "Whom do you think it would be wise to call in this matter of the tripping?" said Flora's father. He opened the door. He gestured for Flora to walk through it. She did. The door swung shut behind them. "Run!" said her father, and they both began to run. At some point, Flora's father started to laugh again. It wasn't a ha-ha-ha kind of laugh. It was a woo-wee kind of laugh. Hysteria, thought Flora. She knew what to do for hysteria. Her father needed to be slapped. Unfortunately, there wasn't time right now. They had to make their getaway. Her father laughed all the way to the car. He laughed when they were in the car. He laughed as he placed his hands at 10 o'clock and 2. He laughed as he backed out of the parking lot and drove away from the giant donut. He stopped laughing only for once, long enough for him to shout, "Holy Bagumba!" in the voice of Dolores the parakeet, and then he went back to laughing. Chapter 34 is called The Getaway. They were making their getaway, but they were making their getaway slowly, because even when Flora's father was thinking that things were hilarious, even when he was talking like a parakeet, he still, apparently, did not believe in speeding. Flora kept looking behind them to see if they were being followed by the cops, or Rita and Ernie. When she finally looked down at Ulysses, his eyes were still closed, and a terrible thought occurred to her. "What if he has a concussion?" she said to her father. Her father, of course, laughed. Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you said about concussions. There was something about making the person with the head injury speak a favorite nursery rhyme so that speech patterns, slurring, etc., could be evaluated. Flora stared at the squirrel. He couldn't speak. Also, she doubted he knew any nursery rhymes. There was a very small cut on his head, but the bleeding had stopped and he was breathing softly, regularly. "Ulysses?" she said. And then she remembered in its entirety an ominous sentence from Terrible Things. "It is absolutely imperative that you keep the potentially concussed patient awake at all times." She shook the squirrel gently. His eyes stayed closed. She shook him harder and he opened his eyes and then closed them again. Flora's heart thudded once and then dropped all the way down to her knees. She was suddenly terrified. "Do superheroes die?" she said out loud. Her father stopped laughing. "Listen," he said, "we won't let him die." Flora's heart thudded again, a different kind of thud. It wasn't fear this time, it was hope. "Does that mean you won't try to hit him over the head with a shovel?" she said. "I won't," said her father. "Ever?" "Ever." "You promise?" "I promise." Her father looked at her in the rearview mirror. Flora looked back. "Let's go to your place then," she said. "He'll be safe there." At these words, George Buckman started laughing hysterically. Again. Chapter 35 is called Fear Smells. And this is the last chapter that we're going to be reading today. Flora's father never walked through the hallways of the Blixen Arms. He ran, and Flora Buckman, holding her possibly concussed squirrel, ran with him. Flora and George Buckman ran because the Blixen Arms is the apartment complex where George Buckman lives, was owned and managed by a man named Mr. Claus, who was in possession of an enormous, angry orange cat, also named Mr. Claus. The cat, Mr. Claus, prowled the hallways of the Blixen Arms, peeing on the residents' doors and vomiting in the stairwells. Mr. Claus was also notorious for hiding in the green gloom of the hallways and waiting until some unlucky person stepped out of the door of his or her apartment, or into the main entrance of the Blixen Arms, or down into the basement laundry room, and then pouncing on the person's ankles, biting and scratching and growling, and sometimes, weirdly enough, purring. Flora's father's ankles were deeply scarred. "The cat can smell your fear," Flora shouted as she ran. "It's a scientific fact." She had read about fear and terrible things can happen to you. "Fear smelled," said terrible things, and the smell of fear further incites the predator. Ahead of her, her father laughed his hearty and seemingly endless laugh. If Flora had more time, she would have said, "For the love of Pete, what's so funny?" But she didn't have time. There was a squirrel to save. And I'm going to leave you off on that cliffhanger. The next chapter that we will read in the next video is chapter 36, and it's called Surprise, Anger, Joy. As always, if you have any predictions, questions, or comments about the book, you can go ahead and leave them in the comment section below. I haven't received any comments yet from you friends, so if you are looking to interact with me about the book in the comment section below, I would absolutely love that, and I'm looking forward to reading them. Anyways, as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I will see you in the next one. And on whatever day you're watching this, I hope you're enjoying your day. Bye, friends.